Good morning, it's 7:08 and you're listening to Upfront. I'm Jeannine Etter. New York City continues to be the epicenter in the U.S. of the COVID-19 pandemic. As of today, the state of New York has over 200,000 confirmed cases and over 14,000 total deaths, with at least 11,000 of those deaths occurring in New York City. For an inside look on what's happening on the ground, we speak with activist Kevin Powell, author of 13 books on race and culture, including The Education of Kevin Powell, Someday We'll All Be Free, and Open Letters to America. Kevin Powell, thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me.
Firstly, how are you processing everything that's been happening in your state and in New York City around this pandemic?
Well, it's so important for people to understand that this is, it's overwhelming emotionally and spiritually and physically to be the epicenter of this pandemic, not just in America at this point, but also in the world. I mean, we have more cases and more deaths than anywhere else. New York State has surpassed every country in the world, and it's mind-blowing to see this happening. I mean, people who have never been to New York need to understand we're the biggest city in the country, over 8 million people here officially, but I believe that's even more than that. It's a very densely populated city. There's tons of people piled on top of each other, a lot of high-rise buildings. And then we have the biggest mass transit system in the country and one of the biggest in the world with, during this peak, before the shutdown, 6 million people would be on the subway every single day in New York City. So it's ripe for a pandemic wreaking havoc, and because of the amount of people, the amount of germs that are spread. And just like everywhere else, we just weren't prepared for this, and so I'm quarantined like everyone else, not quarantined, but isolating in place, sheltering in place. But I have been out as a journalist, as a working journalist myself, and photographer Kay Hickman. I actually have an article that's going to be going up shortly on the New York Times website about a woman named Mama Tanya, who's a community leader here in New York, who has the virus. She's a single mother of 6, amazing African-American woman, and her battles with the coronavirus. And it's really a story about how this virus is disproportionately affected, as you know, Black and brown people and poor people in our country.
So talk a little bit more about that, your documentation and this article. You visited all 5 boroughs with the photographer, is that correct?
That is correct. Kay Hickman took over 1,800 photos. We went to all 5 boroughs on one day, the Bronx, Brooklyn, Queens, Manhattan, and Staten Island. The second day, we went to 4 boroughs, and we interviewed and shot a number of people. Safe distance. We were very careful. We did not ride the subways. We made our way. We rented an SUV and sat apart from each other. But we felt that it was important to really give an on-the-ground perspective. We interviewed people who are working on the front lines. Some of them wanted to speak on the record. Some were anonymous because of fear of losing their work, to be honest about it. We saw people social distancing, wearing masks and gloves, and we saw a number of people who were not wearing masks and gloves, or social distancing. I mean, one of the most heartbreaking 2 images I saw was young Black males in Harlem who were openly defying the social distancing order, no gloves, no mask, shaking hands, giving each other pounds, as we say, passing along blunts and things like that. And then the Hasidic Jewish community in Brooklyn, they have openly defied the social distancing as well, and have been congregating in large groups close together. And so it's devastating to watch, because I pay attention to everything, as I'm sure you do. I read, watch, listen to all kinds of information. I was listening intently to the news on your station leading into our interview. And it's obvious to me that President Donald Trump and his administration are not only inept and incompetent, but that if you study the Spanish flu from 1918, 1919, 100 years ago, and you pay attention to what Harvard scientists are saying and what other folks are saying, including Dr. Fauci, who's been there with the Center for the Office Around Infectious Diseases since 1984, this coronavirus is going to go in waves, and it's very possible that this can go on through 2021, 2022, if we don't take this seriously.
And what do the streets look like? You were mentioning a little bit about people who are defiant and not adhering to the sheltering in place mandates, but what do the streets look like in the city that's dubbed the city that never sleeps now under quarantine?
Well, there's pockets of places that are empty that do look like ghost towns. We have photos of all these things, and we're going to make sure that these images are shared with your station and other media around the country over the coming weeks. But then there's places where people simply are out. I live in Brooklyn, New York, which is the biggest borough out of the 5 boroughs in New York City. We've got over 3 million people in Brooklyn alone. People have been out. People have been out playing, rollerblading, running, doing things. And, it's been encouraged to step out and get some fresh air. That it's okay to run, but come back. But you see people actually sitting down and congregating. That's the problem. And so there's pockets of places where people are defying it. And I want to say this, we can't just blame poor people or people of color. I've seen white sisters and brothers, Asian sisters and brothers, people of middle class and upper class backgrounds, as well as working class people defying this. I think that people don't know what to do, are bored, are restless, are frustrated. Some are not taking it seriously. Some are careless. And this is what we're seeing around New York City. And this is why the mayor of New York had to take down basketball hoops in about 80 to 100 parks, because people were actually playing basketball with gloves on and face masks on, as if that was going to protect them from a contact sport like basketball. This is what we're seeing in New York.
And this week, Governor Cuomo also ordered that New Yorkers wear mandatory masks, which makes sense in a city that's so populated. Are there issues with people getting masks, or just people just being defiant and just don't want to wear them? Or are there shortages that you know of?
There's definitely shortages. I mean, I literally had to get masks for myself shipped from Maryland and Ohio by people in those states. That's how bad it is here. We've seen the photos, the images of nurses having to wear garbage bags as protective equipment in hospitals. I mean, this is something that's ongoing. And then, in the last couple of weeks, the mayor of New York has encouraged people to make their own masks, which you see people actually out there with bandanas on. And I think we all know that bandanas are not face masks. They're not protective, but people wearing masks, bandanas, are wearing scarves. But the thing I want to say too, there is a beauty happening, because you do see people who are seamstress, who are sewers, who are fashion designers, who are saying, okay, we're going to make masks. They're going to have filters on them. We're going to make sure that they're washable and reusable. And so there has been ingenuity and resiliency amidst all of this. So I have to say that about my city as well. It's just it's daunting. And I think the most powerful thing that was said to me this week was from someone in California just yesterday. He said, compared to New York, we are in paradise in California right now, because you all are spread out and is not condensed the way it is here, where you can literally go out and be susceptible the moment you go out your door to getting the virus here in New York City.
And also this week, Governor Cuomo extended the shelter-in-place mandate to May 15th. What are your general thoughts about this? Do you think that this will help at all in slowing the spread of the pandemic?
I think the example is China. They shut it down for 8 weeks. And there's other countries who did the same thing, and that stemmed the tide of this. The problem with us in New York State, specifically New York City, because most of New York State actually lives, at least half of us live in New York City that make up the state of New York. People need to understand the rest of the state is very sparsely populated. And so when you don't have a mandatory stay-at-home rule in place, and mask and gloves, it lends itself to the coronavirus going in waves, which is being predicted for us in New York and around the country. Even the notion of President Trump saying that we're going to open up the economy and open up these states. Well, someone from New York can go to Ohio and help to spread this thing all over again. If we come to California and spread this thing all over again. What's really missing, in my humble opinion, is a national coordination, which other countries have had for our country. You can't have 50 states with 50 different rules. You can't have hundreds of cities with hundreds of different rules on how we're going to mandate this. People need to stay at home. People need to wear gloves and masks when they go outside. And we need to understand that this is something that's not just for a month or a couple of months. This is something that we have to deal with, I believe, for at least the rest of 2020.
We are speaking with activist and author Kevin Powell about what's happening on the ground in the epicenter of the COVID-19 pandemic, New York City. I wanted to ask you, as your perspective as a writer, what do you see with New York City changing, like the landscape and how it's been impacted as a city? It was already going through gentrification, experiencing extreme weather events due to climate change, and now a pandemic of this size.
Well, I think that, honestly, there's going to be a serious exodus of people from New York City. I really believe that that's going to happen. I think it's going to be very similar to what happened around Katrina, because people are profoundly affected by this. One thing that's not being talked about a lot is the devastating mental health toll that this pandemic, is having on us in New York and across the country. We've never experienced anything like this in our lifetimes. If there were people who were around in 1918, 1919, they were more than likely children and have no real memories of that global pandemic that killed 50 million people, the Spanish flu. So this is devastating for us. I mean, even myself, I've thought about, well, do I really want to get on the subway train ever again? Many of us used to wonder why Japanese folks and Chinese folks were wearing masks all the time. I've been to Japan. I wondered that. Well, now I understand, and I can tell you from my own experiences, I'll never go out again on a subway train or an airplane without a face mask. I simply will never do that for the rest of my life. Shaking hands will never happen again for me. I will simply bow the way people do that I saw in Japan and when I was in West Africa, Nigeria. I just think that it's going to change a lot of our behaviors. It's going to be hard for me to even consider going to a restaurant again, because I just think about all the germs and things that are flying around. And it was always the case when you go to restaurants, you're kind of rolling the dice, and we do want to support our local economies. But until there's a vaccination in place, which we're hearing is 1.5 to 2 years away, until we really have this thing under control, people can Google this. Your listeners can Google this. Experts at Harvard University have said this can go on until 2022. That's 2 years away. And so this is something that I think is going to affect our behavior profoundly in New York City for the rest of our lives.
And what's happening in subway stations? Are you saying you haven't visited them? But I was just wondering if there's been a slow.
They're empty. What we did do when the photographer and I were out, we did go to subway stations that were above ground, that were outside for our own safety, honestly, to protect our lives. And you might have seen 1 or 2 people on the subway platforms. That is highly unusual. Again, anyone who's ever seen pictures of New York City, who has been to New York City, the subways are always packed. We saw a couple of subway trains come along, empty. Basically, a few people on the subway trains. And who are they? They're essential workers, the people who have to go to the grocery stores to work, who have to be on the front lines at hospitals to work, folks who might, be folks who are clean or were part of the sanitation system in New York City. But other than that, the subway trains are empty. They're completely empty.
And when we're talking about New York, we hear a lot about people on the front lines in terms of essential workers. Wondering what's going on, particularly with the artists, the activists?
That's a great question. And I was just having this conversation with Jessica Care Moore, one of our great poets who lived in New York for many years, who's back in her home city of Detroit, which is being ravaged by the coronavirus, as well, as I'm sure you all know. Many artists and activists are suffering. Activists who have nonprofit organizations are scrambling to figure out how they're going to preserve their organizations. Artists, imagine if you're a singer or a rapper or you're a poet, you had book signings, you had performances set up, you had tours set up. All of that has been wiped out. And what we really need in New York City and California, around the country, is the same thing that was created during the Great Depression, where opportunities were established for creative people, for social justice people to make a living during the Great Depression. Because again, the other thing that has to be talked about is that this coronavirus is going to tailspin the country into a massive recession. It doesn't matter what Donald Trump is saying, because those of us who really study economics and understand the nature of capitalism, when something like this catastrophic hits, it's going to disproportionately affect poor people, working class people, activists, artists, nonprofit organizations, families, single parent-led families, most of them, as we know, led by women. They're going to be the folks who are most devastated by this. And so even when you look at something like this $1,200 check that everyone's, hoping that they get a stimulus check, I think about Canada, where they have the vision to give Canadian residents $900 every 2 weeks. All we're giving people in America is $1,200, one shot, maybe, that's it. That is a recipe for economic devastation for all kinds of people, including artists and activists.
Would you say that, is there a silver lining to any of this, to what New Yorkers are experiencing? Is there a reduction in crime? Or people being kinder to each other? Is there any ray of hope?
I'm an activist. This is what I do, and I'm an artist. And so we have to have hope. The hope, what I'm seeing is more kindness, more compassion, more love. I think that people are correcting the that they were saying early on that the coronavirus was the great equalizer, that it affects everyone equally. People now realize, look at the article that was just published this week in the New Yorker called The Black Plague. It lays out very brilliantly, the disproportionate number of Black and brown people, working class people, Native American people, poor people who have been affected by this. And so I think there's a growing awareness that has come out of this. I think that people are seeing how ugly this system that we have in America is toward people who don't have the means. I mean, the fact that you see most of the testing that's happening in the wealthiest zip codes around the country, not just New York, but around the country. And so I think it's opening up necessary conversations around race and class and gender that weren't there before. And I also think that people are being resilient. Again, the number of people who are making their own face masks, the number of people who are organizing in their communities, not just in New York, but I'm seeing it and hearing it around the country, food drives and grocery drives for people who may not be able to get it, who live in housing projects, who are elders, people who are shut in. So I think that what we're seeing is a human spirit come out. But the thing that I challenge people on, just like 9/11, just like Hurricane Katrina, just like the hurricanes that affected Houston and Puerto Rico, is it can't just be when there's a crisis. This should, what we really need is what Dr. King called for, a radical revolution of values, because this society, the way it's constructed, does not work for all people, not in New York, not in California, nowhere in this country. And that's the hope I have, that we can shift this and turn it to a place where it needs to go, where everyone has a fair shot at life, because this coronavirus is showing us that some lives matter and some lives still do not matter.
Well, we've been speaking with author, activist, and public speaker Kevin Powell, author of The Education of Kevin Powell, Someday We'll All Be Free, and Open Letters to America, speaking about what's happening on the ground in New York City, the epicenter of the COVID-19 pandemic. Kevin Powell, thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Thank you so much. Have a blessed day.
Yes, you too.